Well, it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today. When Rebecca asked and mentioned that she was chairing this session, she asked me if there was a nutritionist that she thought was, or that I thought would be worth having come present here. And I thought I did two things. I was nice enough to help fulfill Rebecca's need, but also for the other nutritionist here, I kind of laid on the grenade for you. So I bit the bullet and decided I'd give this talk and discussion today. Really what I'm going to focus on is some of the problem-solving processes or things and constraints that we deal with on the nutrition and feeding side of an integrated system. Like Rebecca said, really at the end of the day, as technical folks in an integrated business, we really are just problem solvers. So we're always constantly trying to find solutions or compromises to the best way to attack an issue that we're facing. The first thing I wanted to do is introduce you guys who aren't familiar with Seaboard live production to kind of our business. Today we're about 338,000 sows on 78 commercial sow farms located in 5 states: Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, Texas, and Iowa. We've got about 1.2 million nursery spaces and just under 3.2 million finishing spaces. And today, on the live production side, we employ about 2,500 people. So if you just think about the size and the brevity, and I mean, Marlon can speak to it better, but you know, we're a big ship. We're not a speedboat. So to get everybody headed in the right direction takes some effort. And it's hard to turn around, and we're not the fastest at turning around, but it takes a lot of coordination to get it done. Also, what I wanted to do is kind of give you an idea of our milling capabilities. We have 7 owned feed mills that we manufacture feed out of, and 2 toll milling partners in northwest Iowa that we do business with. Essentially, total we manufacture somewhere between about 50 and 55,000 tons a week to support all of our production. And then one thing I was going to touch on real quick before I get into the constraints was back to what Rebecca mentioned about capturing value. Really, what's different between how we capture value in an integrated system versus as a pork producer? And honestly, really what having vertical integration allows us to do is not only control the cost on the production side of the business, but then also we change essentially the point or the end point of revenue generation, right? So Brad mentioned it this morning of not only can we potentially make money on the live side of the business, but then also we have plant margins that we can make money on too. So, you know, a great example is right now hog markets are pretty sucky, and so a lot of people are looking at ways that we can reduce our costs and our inputs. But at the same time, because we still have the opportunity to capture plant margin, something like growth rate may be worth more to us than just a pork producer. And so, you know, we may look at that slightly differently than a producer who's really, you know, value generation ends at the hot scale in the plant. The other thing that we do too, or we try to do, is look at our economics on a fixed asset basis. And really, we define that asset as a shackle space, right? So a good example, our Guyman plant, we do 20,500 head a day in that plant. So that's 20,500 shackles a day that we're trying to fill. And so, you know, every bit of margin that we can increase per shackle space is profit generation or value in our business. And then, you know, obviously everything that we do, whether we research it, whether we test it, or a change or a modification in a process, we try to model that all the way through and understand all of the plant side margins associated with it. You know, if we're doing a nutrition trial, we want to follow those pigs and those carcasses all the way through the plant and get down to subprimal level detail, so we can understand if we make a modification, we're not going to give up a quality piece of our product, or that we're not going to lose value all the way through the plant and ultimately out the back door of the plant. So really, I always like to list this, and I did this at our grower meeting that we had back in the fall, but as a production nutritionist, I really have 3 goals that I try to work on every day and I try to focus my attention on. Number 1 is that all pigs have feed, right? Air, water, feed, it's the basics. That's what the pigs have to survive. Number 2, all pigs have the right feed. And then number 3, defining what the right feed is. Okay? So really, Ramon Moreno, Craig Maloney, our nutrition group, we spend a lot of time on step 3 trying to define what that right feed is, and that can change based on economics, that can change based on nutrient requirements of the animal, that can change based on what we learn from some of our genetic suppliers and our ingredient suppliers and vendors. But really, steps 1 and 2 take a little bit of time, and they also take a lot of coordination and support from the rest of the business to get accomplished successfully. Not only do we want pigs to have feed, but we got to make sure they have the right feed. And sometimes that ends up taking up more of your time than trying to define what that right feed is, but it's part of being a production nutritionist. So some of the constraints that make that challenging or tough to do in a large integrated system is really some of the site and the barn level constraints that we deal with when we talk about establishing a feeding program. We got different bin sizes. Geez, I think we've got about every type of bin that's ever been made. We've got 6-ton, 9-ton, 10-ton, 14-ton, 24-ton bins. We've even got some of those poly bins that sweat really bad when it's humid out. Hate those things, but we've got them, right? Single versus tandem bin setups. We've got both. So if you've got a single bin setup, you've got to worry about how a site manager places feed on top of feed, mixing a feed in a bin. Some of those things that can cause issues with feed flow or mixing of potential feed grade medications. Feed line configurations. Sometimes you've got a single feed line that feeds multiple nursery rooms. Sometimes each room has its own individual feed line. Level of specificity related to accounting. This is something that we don't really always think about, but some systems define a group of pigs as the barn. Some people define a group of pigs as the site, and some people define the group of pigs as the room. We define it by airspace. Well, we don't always have feed systems that feed pigs by airspace. And so how you manage and control that can be a little challenging at times. Pig flow and fill times. This is one, as we talk about single sourcing pigs and commingling pigs, this is one that can be greatly impacted is how fast does it take me to fill pigs in a site? And then barn and room sizes. We've got barns in Iowa that hold 150 head. We got barns in Iowa that hold 3,000 head. So again, all of those things make it challenging to put together a program that fits all those needs. The other thing too that I would point out, as you think about growth of a large business like this, typically if you're growing through greenfield construction or through acquisition, that can impact the amount of diversity you have in your sites and your farms. And so, we've done both, Joe. And so the things that we built, they all kind of look the same, but the things we acquired, they don't look the same. But we got to manage them all at the end of the day. So to give an example of one of the simpler ways that we've set up our feeding budgets and our programs is we really set them up as pounds per head. So if I'm a nursery manager, I can go to my nursery budget and I can say that all the pigs in my group should receive 6 pounds of the second starter diet. And then they multiply that by their inventory, divide it by 2,000 to calculate a tons per group, and then we round it to our least common denominator, which is a truck compartment size of 3 tons. So that's the best way that we can try to manage feed budgets across all of those barn and site level constraints. So some of the other constraints that we always think about and worry about, from the feed mill, transportation, and compliance side. Within the feed mill, grinding capacity and capabilities. For some feed mills, depending on the situation, your ability to grind grain to make feed can be a limiting factor. Your mixer size, if you're making mash feed, a lot of times your mixer is going to be your point of throughput restriction, right? How long does it take me to batch my feed? How long does it take me to mix? That becomes your limiting factor of throughput. If you're pelleting diets, your pellet mills are going to be your limiting factor. And then one of the unique things that you see across different feed mills is how much finished feed bin capacity do you have? And we'll talk about that a little bit. Truck compartment size, again, for us, that's really the least common denominator in all these differences that I'm talking about, is that a truck compartment can hold 3 tons. And so we try to revert everything back to a 3-ton increment so we can fit those compartments. Biosecurity guidelines, how much downtime do you need to move a feed truck from a finisher back up the pyramid to a bore stud? Those things cause inefficiencies in transportation processes. Medication feeding directions. So if I have a CTC Denagard pulse, I'm directed that I can only feed that for 14 days. So now I've got to incorporate that into my feeding budgets to hit that targeted feeding time. VFD validation and compliance. When I started in 2016, we spent a ton of time working on getting our systems set up to essentially manage VFD compliance. And then obviously medication withdrawal times, flushing and sequencing processes that need to be in place to make sure that we don't get exposure of feed grade medication to pigs that shouldn't receive it. Just to quickly walk through kind of a flow chart through the feed mill, obviously receiving, ingredient storage, grinding, batching, mixing. If you're pelleting, go through the pellet line. Ultimately, what a lot of people forget in a flushing and sequencing procedure is that every point after mixing requires an intervention process to properly flush and sequence. So I've got to flush my mixer, I've got to flush my pellet mill, I've got to flush my cooler, I've got to flush my finished feed bin, I've got to flush that compartment on the truck, I've got to flush my bin, and I got to flush my feeder. And so we've got processes in place on the site to do what we call bin verifications and feeder verifications to accommodate that flushing process. The other thing I would say too, and what I really wanted to illustrate, so as we talk about some of the challenges that we face with feeding programs, so our feed mill in Hugoton, Kansas, it was built with about 760 tons worth of finished feed bin capacity. That's half a day's worth of capacity. That's not much capacity. And so the way that we manage this feed mill is they're really making feed to fill orders because they don't have anywhere to put it once they make it. And so they handle that a lot differently than our Iowa Falls feed mill, which has about 2 days worth of capacity. So what they're really doing is they're trying to manufacture feed to fill finished feed bins. And the other thing that it allows Iowa Falls to do is that they can make all the diets all the time. In Hugoton, Kansas, we can't. And so our feed orders change based on the day of the week so that we can only have to carry or keep certain diets on hand on certain days of the week. And actually, I talked to the mill manager there. If they get an emergency outage called in for a medicated feed on a day that they're making clean finishing feed, it takes them roughly 2 hours to get that feed through the mills, into a finished feed bin, onto a truck, and out to the site. So that's 2 hours worth of lost production time, or roughly 160 tons worth of production that they lose from something as simple as an emergency outage that requires being filled. You know, another thing that everybody looks at and says, man, that's really simple. All you got to do is call them and they make it for you and send it to you. Feed ordering is a very complex process. I don't know how many conversations I've had with Joe Locke, who's our senior production operations manager, about just how tough this can be sometimes and all the people that have to be involved in getting this done right. Really what you're trying to do is ensure you're following your group feed budgets properly and then trying to optimize your transportation, essentially your fleet of vehicles, and optimize your feed mill production. And that's pretty darn tough depending on your situation and your needs. One thing that we've tried to put more reliance on and continue to get better at is really try to take some of the human elements out of feed ordering. And so we've started working on an internal feed ordering system that we can use to really help monitor whether or not we're feeding the right diets, the right time. The system's set up that it tracks your feed budgets and usages. It identifies overfeeding of a certain diet. We've got it linked up with Global Vet Link, so Rebecca can write a VFD, and essentially the ordering system pulls it in automatically, matches up that VFD with the farm, the medication regimen, the feed type, the feed budget, and the feed form, so that ultimately we can try to get the right feed to the pigs, that step 2 process that I talked about adequately. And again, here's just some visual examples of the errors that occur when somebody tries to enter an order for a diet that either is out of sequence, over budget, or trying to order a medicated feed that doesn't have a valid VFD. So the other thing I would say about some of the challenges with a large system like this is really how do you change or implement a different strategy regarding to your feeding program. The first thing I'd say is that you have to weigh out how simple do I make that process versus how complex do I make it. And the other piece is effective communication. So the first one, simple versus complex, I can sit in my office and I can have the absolute best plan to feed my pigs, but it's not worth anything if I can't get it done by the people in the farm. And so for us, there's a lot of value in simplicity of making sure that it can be implemented successfully by a wide range of folks that are on the SLAT level. Also, from an effective communication standpoint, if I make a change to our nursery feed budget, I can't spend all day calling up all of our individual farm managers and notifying them of the change. So I've got to make sure I follow our organizational chart, work through Joe and the operations managers to disseminate that information successfully through their staff and groups so that we can ultimately get it implemented successfully. A good example of an implementation or a simple feeding program that we have, so our sow gestation feeding program, we essentially have 2 feeding levels that we use in gestation based on visual body condition. Our base feed setting, which is 3.5 pounds per day for sows that are in ideal or heavy condition, and then a 6-pound allocation for sows that are visually assessed as thin. So 2 settings. And our process incorporates or includes doing visual assessment of body condition every other week throughout gestation. So again, a simple plan. It's actually really good too because when we go visit farms, it's easy for us to tell whether they're following the directions or not, because if they're not on one of 2 settings, they're not doing something right. And then I'd also say at the bottom, no good deed goes unpunished. And I don't mean don't be nice to people. What I mean is that a lot of times if we're going to ask somebody to do more in some area, that means they're likely going to have to give something up somewhere else. So it's always weighing not only what am I going to pick up from making a change or adding more work, but what am I willing to give up by doing that as well. So it's always, you got to kind of pay the piper. So in summary, really leveraging vertical integration redefines our ability or where we measure profitability. As simple as the goals of a production nutritionist sound, they are fairly complex and challenged to accomplish in a big system. Implementation and execution is sometimes tougher than development of a program. And simplicity and good communication are paramount in implementation and execution of processes and programs. So some of the things that I think we've got a lot of opportunity for in the future and growth of our business is to centralize information. One thing that we see is as we've grown, we've got individual silos of data, and sometimes they don't talk well with each other. And so if we can reduce process delays, reduce the demand on clerical staff, and accelerate reporting capabilities, that's only going to help improve our business. And obviously technologies that can offset labor are huge, and any technologies that can reduce population variation are big as well. So then I always like to finish off with a good image. This is actually, the first time I saw this was at a Tommy Crenshaw presentation back when I was working on my master's, looking at some of the issues that we've seen in the realm of vitamin D requirements in the pig. And to give you some background, my master's and PhD, I did a lot of vitamin D work. And I'm going to touch on this briefly because I went a little long, but I would just want everybody in here to think about or consider some of the pitfalls that I've seen looking at diagnostic results related to nutritional issues. So just kind of some things to keep in mind, or things to be wary of or leery of. We got to make sure that we sample from both our general population and our challenge population. That sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, and we wonder why a pig who hasn't eaten for a week is low in a serum level of a nutrient. We got to ask, does the clinical pathology fit the clinical signs? My pigs are scouring, but my diagnostics results say they're low in vitamin D. I don't know if we have a whole lot of causative information that those two things are related. Try to understand the metabolic markers. If results are accompanied by reference ranges, understand the source of the reference range. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, well, I got this result back. The lab said that the range was 50 to 60 and it's 40. Well, that range is for an adult pig, and you took a sample from a neonatal pig, so do you expect that to be the same? Answer that. Understand analytical procedures and the variation associated with those procedures. And if worse comes to worse, just contact your nutritionist or your associated nutritionist. We don't have horns and tails, unfortunately, but we are willing to work with you guys to come up with a unified solution. So, and with that, thanks everybody.